Tolstoy wrote that at 30 years old, one of the most precise minds in literary history, and he couldn't explain why his own emotions refused to stay in one place. Most people assume emotional swings are a sign of weakness, or instability, or something that needs to be fixed. But the mind doesn't swing between extremes by accident. It follows a pattern. And that pattern, once you see it, changes everything. Psychologists have a name for the pattern: emotional lability, the tendency of emotional states to shift rapidly, sometimes within hours, sometimes within minutes, between poles that feel completely incompatible: joy and despair, clarity and confusion, love and indifference. Not because the person is broken, but because the brain was never designed to hold a single emotional state indefinitely. The neuroscience is unambiguous on this. Emotions are not states. They are processes. They arise, peak, and dissolve, exactly like waves. The problem isn't that emotions move. The problem is that we were taught they should stay still. Virginia Woolf understood this from the inside. She didn't experience her extremes as malfunction. She experienced them as evidence that the self is not a fixed point. It is a moving field. And the mind, rather than being the observer of that field, is often swept along by it. For most of human history, the dominant advice about emotions was simple: control them. The Stoics built entire philosophical systems around the mastery of emotional response. And there is wisdom in that. But there is also a fundamental misunderstanding, one that modern neuroscience has quietly exposed. You cannot control what you haven't first understood. And most people have never been taught what their emotional extremes actually are. Here's what the research shows. When someone experiences a sharp emotional shift from calm to rage, from euphoria to emptiness, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for rational decision-making, doesn't just slow down. It goes partially offline. You are not choosing to feel what you feel. The feeling is choosing you. And the belief that you should be able to simply override it is not discipline. It's a misunderstanding of how the brain works. And this is where the trap appears. The person who tries hardest to suppress emotional extremes often produces the strongest ones. Because suppression doesn't dissolve emotional energy. It compresses it. And compressed emotional energy doesn't disappear. It waits. In the 1980s, psychologist James Gross began studying what happens when people try to regulate their emotions. His findings were precise and uncomfortable. People who chronically suppressed their emotional states showed higher physiological arousal, not lower. Their hearts beat faster. Their cortisol levels were elevated. Their memory of emotional events was impaired. Suppression, Gross concluded, costs more than it saves. But here is what's more interesting. Gross also studied a different strategy, one he called cognitive reappraisal. Not suppression, not avoidance, but the deliberate act of observing an emotional state and changing the meaning assigned to it. The people who practiced this showed lower physiological stress, better memory, and, critically, greater emotional flexibility over time. They didn't stop feeling extremes. They stopped being defined by them. This is a distinction most people never learn. The goal is not the absence of emotional extremes. The goal is the capacity to observe them without being consumed by them, to feel the wave fully, and to know, even inside it, that you are not the wave. You are the one watching it. History's most precise observers of the mind were not people who conquered their emotions. They were people who studied them. Marcus Aurelius spent years writing to himself, not to perform wisdom, but to understand his own oscillations. His meditations are not a record of a stable mind. They are a record of a mind in constant conversation with its own extremes: doubt, fatigue, grief, clarity, anger, equanimity, back and forth. For decades, Carl Jung gave this phenomenon a name. He called it enantiodromia, from the Greek, the tendency of things to turn into their opposites. Jung observed that the more rigidly a person identified with one emotional pole, permanent optimism, constant control, relentless productivity. The more violently the opposite would eventually emerge. The mind, he argued, seeks balance not through moderation, but through alternation. Extreme follows extreme, until the person learns to hold both. And this is what the historical record shows. The minds that contributed most to human understanding were rarely emotionally stable in the conventional sense. Darwin suffered from anxiety and mysterious physical collapses. Newton experienced what we would now recognize as severe depressive episodes. Dostoevsky was epileptic, chronically indebted, and emotionally volcanic. These were not minds that had resolved their extremes. They were minds that had learned to work inside them. There's a cost to emotional extremes that doesn't show up in the obvious places. It doesn't show up as outbursts or breakdowns. Though it can, it shows up earlier, in decisions made from the wrong emotional state, in relationships shaped by oscillations the person never examined, in the chronic exhaustion of a mind that swings between poles without ever understanding why it's swinging. Psychologist Paul Ekman spent decades mapping the relationship between emotional states and consequential decisions. His conclusion was precise. The most damaging decisions humans make are not made in moments of obvious distress. They are made in the seconds immediately after an emotional shift, the moment when one state is ending and another hasn't yet arrived. The gap between extremes. That is where most damage is done. And this is a pattern most people live inside, without ever naming it. The emotional extreme arrives. They react from inside it. The reaction creates consequences. The consequences generate a new emotional state, which generates a new reaction. And the cycle repeats. Not because the person is weak, but because the cycle was never made visible. What is unconscious runs on its own schedule, regardless of intention, regardless of intelligence, regardless of how much the person believes they are in control. The mind shifts between emotional extremes because that is what minds do, not as a flaw, not as a sign of instability, but as a fundamental rhythm of a system designed to respond to the world. The question has never been how to stop the oscillation. The question is always whether you are watching it, or whether it is watching you, because the moment you can observe the swing without being the swing, something changes. Not the emotion, not the extreme, but your relationship to it. And that relationship, quiet, unglamorous, and invisible to everyone around you, is the only thing that was ever actually within your control. The mind doesn't need to be still. It needs to be seen. Inner observer. Observe your mind. Understand reality.